Who are you? And where are you going? What do you want?
Hello and welcome to Business Lessons from the Military. I'm your host, Kevin Bemmel, and we are here every Tuesday at 10 a.m. Pacific time to talk about military history, doctrine, and the practices of great military leaders, all by way of distilling lessons that we can use in our businesses and professional practices to become more successful. So for those of you who saw the social media posts promoting this episode, or perhaps you are on my email list, and so you got the email this morning. Today I'm going to talk about the essential qualities for winning, and I'm actually not going to be I'm going to be talking about the Battle of Trafalgar. But more specifically about the things that Admiral Horatio Lord Nelson used in order to be victorious in what is, perhaps the most famous British sea battle of all time. That and the defeat of the Spanish Armada, I would say, are probably the two best known British Royal Navy victories. So I've distilled down 7 points, if you will, about how Nelson handled himself at the Battle of Trafalgar, and how he pursued the Battle of Trafalgar and leadership in general, in order for us to see how we can apply his greatness. That's the only way to put it, to our businesses and practices. So just to give you just a little bit of background. So the Battle of Trafalgar was fought on October 21st, 1805. So we're at the almost the 219th anniversary of the Battle of Trafalgar. And it was a decisive naval engagement during the Napoleonic Wars. It saw the British Royal Navy, under the command of Admiral Horatio Lord Nelson, defeat a combined fleet of the French and Spanish navies. And the Napoleonic Wars, obviously, was Napoleon was really the dictator of France at that time, Napoleon Bonaparte. He was derisively called Boney by the British. It was a time of great French pride post French Revolution, but ostensibly Napoleon was fighting for the République. But he eventually did become a dictator. And just as an aside, I will say, as a Jew, that I have mixed feelings. As a Jew and as an historian, I have mixed feelings about Bonaparte, because he was extremely good to Jews in France while he was in power. At the same time, he led brutal wars against the English and also the Russians. And in fact, it was his war against Imperial Russia that really was his downfall. But in any event, I'm going to be dealing with the British side primarily in this show. So like I said, I've got 7 thoughts I want to share with you. So the first one is preparation and training matter. So the British fleet was highly, highly disciplined and very well trained. And that was the result of, first of all, consistent drilling as well as experience gained from previous engagements. So for those of you who are familiar with the Horatio Hornblower book series, or the um, um, I'm all of a sudden going up on it, Master and Commander, which is actually the more famous of the two. So both of these series of books are set, at least in the beginning, during the Napoleonic Wars. And Horatio Hornblower in particular is a fanatic about gunnery practice. And I think almost every single book in the series deals with it. And the British Navy really expended a tremendous amount, not only of time, but of resources, because in order to exercise gunnery practice, you had to use gunpowder, you had to use shot, and you had to use, water, etc. And so, but nonetheless, it was that constant drilling that made the sailors so effective. And this translates directly into our businesses and practices. So if we're a professional practice, we should always be learning more about our profession. So I know one of the reasons I do this show is of course to spread information, but also I learn things. This is one of my vehicles for consistent training, knowing virtually every week of the year I'm going to be in front of you talking about how to apply military lessons to the business world. So I've got to always be learning, always be training in new business ideas, in reviewing the principles of success, the principles of leading and managing a business, or in my case, a professional practice. But as well, we need to continually engage in professional studies, or if we're not in a profession, if we're in a trade, plumbing, electrical, all of these things are very complex these days, and we need to be constantly, or not constantly, but consistently engaged in training, looking at new techniques, seeing how they will apply to our businesses, learning how to use them, etc. So, and as well, we need to be prepared for when opportunity presents itself. So I know from myself, when I meet someone, one of the first things they ask is, do you have information about your company? And I used to say, yes, you can go to my website. And the problem with that is it's requiring a potential client to take action. And so I created a one sheet that gives a summary of my practice, along with the costs associated with my services. And I say, yes, I can send you a one-page summary of my practice, a one sheet, and you can keep that on file. If when I deal with attorneys, I say, you can, if you want to refer me, this is a nice piece that you can send to your clients so they can learn a little bit about me. And then, my website is in there as well. So if they want to learn more, they can always go to my website. So making sure that we're prepared for opportunity is of course a very important aspect of winning. Okay, next, communication and coordination. So Nelson used signals throughout the engagement, and his pre-battle plan ensured that his commanders understood what their roles were, even in the chaos of battle. So there is no getting away from it, whether it's a land battle, whether it's a sea battle. It is chaotic, and as von Moltke said, our plans never survive first contact with the enemy, right? And so there needs to be a way for commanders and their their more junior unit commanders to be able to communicate. So on shipboard, especially in the days of square-rigged sailing ships, this was done through flags. There were no radios or shouting through megaphones. They wouldn't be heard over the boom of the cannons, etc. And so Nelson developed a pretty sophisticated communication system so that he could communicate with the commanders of the various ships in his fleet. And again, it was something he drilled, and as a result, they coordinated quite smoothly. The same principle goes in our businesses. I think one of the challenges of having essentially instantaneous worldwide communication is we do not plan it in advance. And that can be problematic, because if we get into a crisis situation, we need to be able to quickly and efficiently communicate with our people. If everybody is calling in to us as the leader in order to find out what needs to happen, that will clog up communications. It will actually retard our ability to deal with the crisis. And so there should be a communication plan, both for seriously bad situations, but also for seriously good situations. So if you launch a new initiative and it really takes off, and all of a sudden everybody's calling in, what do we do? What do we do? Right? That having that tangle of communications can mean that you're not able to take maximum advantage of this initiative that has turned out to be, perhaps it's going even better than you thought it would. So simply relying on the fact that, with text messages and phones and WhatsApp and Telegram and all these, different communications avenues are available, the avenues are not the communication. The communication is the communication. So what are the lines of communication? What are the most efficient ways for people to present a particular issue? So when I was the chaplain at the submarine squadron at Point Loma, so our Commodore had a very specific way he wanted us to, when we sent him, a very specific format, I should say, when we sent him emails. And we had to start out with BLUF, BLUF, which stands for bottom line up front. In other words, he wanted a 2 or at most 3 line summary of the issue, why it's an issue, and what we were proposing to deal with it, all within that first 1 to 3 lines. Okay. And then below that, he wanted a second section labeled discussion that would go into more detail. The reason he wanted it that way was he was enormously busy, and he wanted to be able to very efficiently go through his email. And in many cases, he was, as long as he knew what the issue was, why it was a problem, and what we were recommending, that was all he cared to know about it. I know for me as the chaplain, I rarely think he got down into the discussion. He usually wanted to have those face to face for whatever reason. Okay. And now sometimes I'm sure he did want to go into the discussion for other matters that were more complex. It also, I think, depended on the closeness of the relationship he had with a particular member of the staff. So having a communication format can also help communication and coordination happen much more smoothly. So this idea of BLUF and then details or discussion can be a very good way of streamlining your communication in your businesses and practice. Next is Nelson was able to exploit the enemy's weaknesses. So first of all, neither the French nor the Spanish fleets were as well trained and experienced as the British fleet. And so that alone gave Nelson an advantage that he could use against them. But also, Because they were a combined fleet, the communication between the French and the Spanish fleets was much more difficult than was for Nelson to communicate among his own fleet. Not only did you have different cultures in the Spanish and French Navy, but you also had a language barrier, right? The French spoke French and the Spanish spoke Spanish, right? Now, it wasn't unusual for especially officers to speak more than one language, but in the heat of battle, to need to be shouting orders in a language that isn't your first language it's more difficult, right? And so Nelson was able to take care of those weaknesses as well as others in order to be victorious at the Battle of Trafalgar. Now, from our business standpoint, we need to be looking at our competition's weaknesses. So for example, looking at the restaurant business right now, bankruptcies are, I don't know if they're at an all-time high, but they're very, very high. There are a lot of restaurants struggling, especially more sort of sit-down restaurants that tend to be higher priced than fast food and more sort of casual dining than. So something like like TGI Fridays just went into bankruptcy, I think either earlier this week or the end of last week. So these are weaknesses that other restaurants can take advantage of. So will TGIFs be able to emerge from bankruptcy? Who knows? But the fact that they're in bankruptcy gives another restaurant operator an opportunity. Maybe there are some really great locations that TGIF has. Maybe they can get in, buy those locations, rebrand them as their restaurants, and have a very quick way of expanding in various markets. And in so doing, also essentially take away a source of competition for them. So rather than opening brand new locations, they can essentially take over these existing locations and pull those out of a competitor, make them their own, right? So that would be exploiting an enemy's weakness. That's just one example. Now, for all businesses, all practices, it's important to look at your competition's weakness. So my friend Bill Gross, who was on the show a few weeks ago, who does probate real estate, one of the weaknesses that he exploits among his competitors is that even the ones who oftentimes represent themselves as specializing in probate, they don't have anything like the level, the depth, and the breadth of knowledge of probate and estate matters that Bill has. And so he's been able to, over the last several years, to parlay that into a very robust practice. He can speak to lawyers and accountants on their terms and using their language, which a lot of even specialty so-called specialty probate real estate people just can't do. So Bill knows where you can go on the court website and get probate notes, to see what the status of a case is. I dare say that there are not very many real estate agents, even those specializing in probate, who know how to use the online court system as well as Bill does. And so these are ways of exploiting our competition's weaknesses. Part of it has to do with training and preparation, but part of it also has to do with just committing to being better than your competition, finding out what is out there that I can do, that I can offer to my customers, my clients, that my competition cannot or will not offer. Okay. Next, and this is some of these things interrelate. So Nelson used innovative tactics to overcome numerical disadvantage. So Nelson's fleet was smaller than the combined Franco-Spanish fleet. He had fewer overall ships, and if he was going to take them essentially head on, he was going to be at a big disadvantage. And so Nelson used the unorthodox tactic of splitting his fleet into two columns that attacked perpendicularly, I think that's the word, to the enemy's fleets and broke through their lines. Okay, now this is dangerous because in wooden-hulled sailing ships, there was a maneuver called crossing the T, where a ship would come up alongside an enemy combatant, blast a broadside at it, come across the front of that ship and blast the enemy combatant from head on, make a U-turn and do the same thing again. And the reason they would do that is because when you are crossing that T, you can bring all your guns to bear on the other ship, but the ship can only fire with a couple of forward aimed guns. Usually they're much smaller and not nearly as powerful as their main cannons, which fire from the sides of the ship. And so they might fire a special type of shot called a chain shot that tears up the rigging of the ship, brings down some of the spars, maybe even the upper part of the masts. They might fire grape shot, which would wipe out the sailors on deck, or they might fire just regular cannonballs in an effort to try and pierce the lower region of a mast, which were very, very large. But if they could pierce it or damage it, they might cause that mast to collapse. And not only would that take away the ship's ability to power itself because the masts are now down, so the wind can't catch the sails. Oftentimes, those masts and sails would fall into the water and serve as an anchor, essentially stopping the ship. Now the ship is dead in the water, and the attacking ship can just essentially sink it at will, because half of the combatant ship guns can't be brought to bear, and so it's really just cannon fodder at that point. Okay, so excuse me. When we look at our businesses, oftentimes there are going to be larger competitors, and there's no doubt about it that larger competitors can be very, very powerful. So one of the favorite tactics of large companies is to support heavy government regulation that's very costly to comply with, and in so doing make it much more difficult for smaller competitors to compete. Okay, so in order to deal with that, okay, smaller companies have to be much more efficient. Okay, number one, they need to perhaps band together into some type of professional organization to fight these actions of large companies to try and get the government to create a crippling level of regulation. That's one thing. They may need to band together in some sort of purchasing cooperative so that they can get better pricing on, say, office supplies. So a large company is buying a lot more office supply. They can negotiate discounts, that sort of thing. a small company just can't get because they don't do the volume of business that a large company does. However, if a lot of small companies band together and create a purchasing cooperative, so now they gain purchasing power and they gain leverage. I'm using office supplies, but it could be for anything that would get them lower prices and allow them through this innovative tactic to better compete with large companies. Now, it's interesting to note that one of the things the internet has done is it has made it much easier for small companies to compete with their larger competitors with things like online ads, online advertising, social media marketing. All of these things small businesses can use very creatively, and they can compete and in some cases overtake larger companies. Maybe not in terms of sales, of course, but in terms of, for example, profitability percentages, those kind of things, in a way that before the internet they could not. So one of the areas where you see this is, again, and I'm going to go back to the real estate industry. So it used to be, going back to the 70s, 80s, and even into the 90s, most agents worked for a large real estate company, and because it benefited them to be known as whatever it was, a Century 21 agent, a Coldwell Banker agent, it's a Keller Williams agent. Nowadays, the company that an agent works for means very, very little to the public in terms of choosing a real estate agent. What matters is the individual agent. That change has come about largely in part, although not only in part, only because of, but largely because of individual agents' ability to market themselves using social media, online advertising, etc. And so understanding how these tools can be used to compete with our larger competitors can be very important. Okay. Oh, shoot. There was another example I was going to give. It was going through my head as I was talking. So the advent of AI is potentially another tool that we as small business owners or those with small practices can use to compete more effectively with larger competitors, because AI can do even now, it's where it's not at all making good on its promise, but nonetheless it makes us much more efficient. So for example, one of the places I use AI just because it's fun and because it saves me a lot of time is, when I do my show Jiggers's Place, I mix a cocktail to start out, and I like to theme the cocktail to the topic of the show. So what I used to do was search all over the internet looking for a cocktail that someone else had created that I thought would work well, for that particular show. The last several shows that I've done, I've gone to ChatGPT and I basically said, create a cocktail with this theme. And most recently I said, create a whiskey cocktail with this theme. So you'll see this. If you join me on Thursday for Jiggers's Place, you'll see what I've gotten. And it saves me a lot of time because I can go to ChatGPT, it'll design a cocktail for me. And I think what it's doing is, it's looking at thousands of cocktail recipes probably, and it figures out what spirits and mixers will work well together, right? And it comes up with something, something original, right? So that it takes me a lot less time to figure out my cocktail each week. Plus, it gives me the recipe, so I can just copy it out of ChatGPT and into the email that I send, so that people who are on my email list have the recipe and they can make the cocktail along with me. So figuring out how to use AI, how to use social media, how to use online advertising, all of these things can be used innovatively on a tactical level in order to compete with our larger competitors. Okay, next, decisive leadership and initiative. So one of my, I don't know, bugaboos, I guess, is the idea of let me talk about Nelson's leadership first of all. So Nelson was a bold and decisive leader. He was willing to take risk, but it was calculated risk, and he also invested a high degree of confidence in the captains of his various ships. And his most famous signal in the Battle of Trafalgar was, "England expects every man to do his duty." That was a demonstration of leadership and confidence in his people that really galvanized his men and inspired them on to victory. Nelson is, I wouldn't call myself, a scholar of the Royal Navy by any stretch, but listening to Alex Loxton, who is a wonderful British historian. Since I mentioned her name, if you are at all interested in British history, follow Alice Loxton on Instagram at History Alice. She does wonderful short videos. She recently wrote a book called 18. Well, I should not recently wrote it. Her book 18 came out, I think, just a month or two ago. It's a wonderful book. And one of the people that she profiles in her book 18 is Horatio Nelson when he was a young man, right? So he was an inspirational leader. Now, so going back to what I was started a moment ago, one of my bugaboos about leadership is this whole notion of being a servant leader. I think that's somewhat of a conflict of terms. So I think the intention behind it is that leadership should be looking for a way to solve his subordinates' problems so that they can act more effectively. Now, doing that is certainly a part of leadership, but I don't think it's the essence of leadership. The essence of leadership is to provide inspired direction so that everybody in an organization, whether it's a military unit, whether it's a business, whether it's a professional practice, have a strong sense of what the mission is and how we're going to accomplish it. That is really leadership. To a certain extent, servant leadership is more of a management function, and the two are not the same. And I think this is an area where my friend Mark Brooker and I disagree a little bit. And Mark's been on the show, I think, this show a couple of times over the years. And Mark has wonderful ideas about leadership. He was indeed a tremendously gifted leader in the Navy. But what I think what I think he does, it's sometimes hard for us to see ourselves. Mark is an inspirational guy. so when he is among his people, talking to them, finding out what they're doing, understanding what hurdles they have, that is as much of his leadership as is his ability to unblock those blockages or help them get over those hurdles. So I think we should not get moored in this idea of servant leadership. That is a part of leadership, or maybe it's the management part of leadership, but we really need to be clear about the inspirational, decisive type of leadership that keeps our organizations focused on meeting the mission, right? And this is where someone like an Elon Musk, I think, really succeeds. So SpaceX, for example, he sets these very lofty goals, very inspiring goals, and by his own actions works to achieve them. And so that is why, not the only reason certainly, but I think that's one of the reasons why SpaceX has taken such a leading role in commercial space flight. It's due to his inspirational and decisive leadership, and we can all bring that to our businesses and professional practices. Okay, next, this is number 6 on the list. So one of the things that that Nelson was striving for at Trafalgar was to take strategic control of the seas and make the British Navy, the British Royal Navy, the predominant navy. So although the defeat of the Spanish Armada in the very late, I believe it was very late 16th century, sort of started a period of growth for the British Navy, I think it wasn't until Nelson's time that the British Navy really became recognized as the preeminent navy in the world. Until then, the French and the Spanish navies could, on some level, compete with the British Navy. But after Trafalgar, it was pretty well established that Britain had strategic control of the seas. And they retained that control pretty much until World War II, when the United States Navy took over that position. Now, that's not to say that they weren't challenged. Certainly in World War I, the German Navy did their best to challenge the British Navy. But the reality is the Germany has never been a particularly powerful seagoing nation, certainly not like England, which is an island, or Great Britain, which is an island, and relies on shipping for essentially its very existence. Okay, so because of that, Nelson, because of the striving to control the seas strategically, that gave Nelson the, how shall I put this, the arguments he needed in Parliament to get the resources that were necessary to do the training, to learn about other nations' fleets, and so that he could exploit their weaknesses. So without the resources, Nelson would not have been victorious at Trafalgar. Okay, and so the same is true for our businesses and practices. So we need to have a strategic vision that people are attracted to, so that they will support our winning, whether it's by finding investors who can see that we have a sound strategy that's going to allow us to capture a certain percentage of market share, whether it's finding quality personnel, high quality personnel, who will give us the intellectual capital that we need in order to realize our strategic vision. All of these things are important. And people, I think, want to feel like they are going to emerge victorious. They are going to emerge in control in some way Okay. I don't think most people want to be working in a company or working in a professional practice where they're constantly being buffeted back and forth, right? I think they feel much more confident when they feel like this strategically, this is what we're trying to grab and control and hold on to. And then once we get it, now it's a matter of maintaining it. Now, one has to be careful. You look at companies like IBM. IBM was the biggest mainframe computer company in the world, and they essentially had strategic control over that part of the computer industry. Now, IBM is a large consulting company, but when it comes to making computers, they're nothing really. So, so we have to be careful about not resting on our laurels when we have strategic control of a market segment, let's say. Having said that, it does make for a goal that helps us exercise decisive and inspired leadership. Finally, and this may be the most important quality that Nelson demonstrated, not just at Trafalgar, but throughout his career. And in the end, it really, secured his permanent fame. And that is his ability to take risk, especially calculated risk, and his willingness to sacrifice. So for those of you who know the results of the Battle of Trafalgar, Nelson was mortally wounded during the battle, although he wasn't killed immediately. He was wounded, taken below decks, where he did eventually die. Okay, but the fact that he was willing to risk all in this, what was looked at by the British as an existential battle, really solidified his ability to win. Okay, now I'm not suggesting that, as you, those of you who watch this show, have watched the show before, I'm not suggesting that business is an existential endeavor. I don't believe that. We're not looking to, crush or worse yet, kill the enemy. Not at all. Not at all. However, we do need to be willing to sacrifice for the success of our businesses and practices. If we are always demanding long hours of our people, of our teammates, but we're unwilling to share in those long hours, we are not making the sacrifice that's necessary in order for the business to succeed. If we are not willing to make sure that our team members get paid before we do, we are not making the kind of sacrifice that would justify the kind of success we probably want. Okay. And if we're not willing to risk maybe our investment in the company, or not, I don't necessarily mean that our entire investment, but if we're not willing to invest capital in our business, if we're not willing to, let's say we've made a lot of money in a business or a practice, and now we're being faced with a very difficult competitive challenge. If we're not willing to reinvest in the business to keep it viable, to keep it growing, to keep it in its strategic position, or for it to invest in it to alter its strategic outlook so it can regain control of a market segment, then why would our people want to take risks for the business? Why would they want to sacrifice for the business? So Admiral Horatio Lord Nelson was willing to do these things, not foolishly, but in a calculated way that gave him this amazing triumph in the Battle of Trafalgar. And we too should be inspired by that example to be willing to take calculated risks and make sacrifices, not just for the sake of our business, but for the sake of our teammates, so that they feel that there is really something of value at stake in what we're doing. So all of these 7 points that I raised, all of them give us the opportunity to learn the essential qualities necessary to win, the essential factors necessary for victory. And, um, Admiral Horatio Lord Nelson, again, perhaps the greatest uh, naval officer in the history of the Royal Navy. Study his life. Get Alice Loxton's book. I'll put a link to it in the show notes after the show posts on LinkedIn. Read about him. Read about the Battle of Trafalgar. Be inspired by this as you navigate the business world, as you navigate your practice to ever greater levels of success. So that's our show for today. Tomorrow at 10 a.m. Pacific time is my show, People Making Money. And my topic is one of my favorites, which I've never talked about before, which is practice doesn't make perfect. Now you're saying, oh this is heresy. I learned my whole life practice makes perfect. Not according to Doug Lemov. And I'm going to be talking about his book, Practice Perfect. And I think I can demonstrate to you that indeed practice all by itself is not going to get you where you want to go. And then on Thursday, I already mentioned my show Jiggers' Place. Okay, that is at 5 p.m. Pacific time on Thursday. And my show this week is about how to gain happiness. And it is another one of those counterintuitive factors in life that the way many of us pursue finding happiness turns out to lead to unhappiness, and what we avoid, we would be much better off embracing. So I hope you'll join me for a cocktail and a chat on Thursday at 5 p.m. at Jiggers' Place. And then next week at 10 a.m. Pacific time on Monday is my show, Trusts and Estates Weekly. And actually, I take that back. Next week is Veterans Day, so we'll have a special show for Veterans Day, saluting our military veterans. And then we'll be back a week from today with the next edition of Business Lessons from the Military. So once again, I thank you very much for joining me. By the way, I mentioned my YouTube channel. If you are not a subscriber, I would really appreciate it if you would consider subscribing. That way you'll be notified anytime we go live for a show, and you can join us live. And if you're not able to do that, you'll know at least that about an hour later, there'll be a new show for you to watch on the channel. So would love to have you as a subscriber, and would deeply appreciate it. As well, please feel free to share your comments. I had a great comment on a show, on an episode of this show earlier today on LinkedIn, asking about a particular topic. And I suggested a couple of episodes to the person who posted the comment, but then added, if these aren't on target or enough on target for you, let me know. I'll be happy to develop a show addressing your specific interest, and would be happy to do that for all of you as well. So thank you again for watching today. Wishing you a wonderful rest of the day, and signing off as I always do. Marie, you